Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. This is part 2 of a multi-part series that is supposed to be serving as an introduction or a preamble to the initial series of History Comes Alive with Jeff Nichols, to study in the birth of the United States of America. And I'm glad that you came back. I'm very excited to get through the next couple of episodes so that we can move on to the actual storyline. Now, whenever you study history, a time, a place, a people, it's always a good idea to try to get a handle on the situation, to gather enough peripheral facts to begin to build a good foundation with which to measure and weigh information as you receive it. This is what we're going to continue to do here. In our first episode, we began to work through the various people groups that were present at the dawn of British colonial America. We also talked a little bit about what was going on in Europe at the time, and there was a lot. We really only barely scratched the surface, but that's okay. I want to give enough context to help us develop a working understanding that we can apply to our focus, which is North America. I hope I'm successful in developing that storyline enough without going down too many rabbit trails, and suddenly it feels like this is a history of Europe, rather than the development of what would become known collectively as the 13 British colonies. And we're going to continue to take field trips across the Atlantic periodically when I think it's necessary to develop the situation at hand, whatever that might be. And I may leave some loose ends along the way, and that's okay. Some of the best teachings or lectures or books or speeches that I've heard have left me with more questions than answers. They tend to pique my curiosity. They encourage me to explore and to learn on my own. They do not spoon-feed me my opinion, but rather prepare me to work that out for myself. That's my goal. I can only hope to be that kind of successful here. I truly hope to make history come alive. If you recall, we took a very quick look at the natives already here. Just a drive-by. We recognized that slaves were here almost from the beginning. We talked a little about the Spanish and the French. We just planted some seeds to get us started. We got a very good general overview of Europe and the power shifting, the cultural shifting really that was going on. We'll certainly develop each of these groups in more detail as we need to throughout the series. But for now, let's continue to develop the cast of characters. Well, you remember, first of all, we had 2 primary goals for this series. The first one was the development of British colonial unity, and the second was the relevance of the native population. So there's 2 groups left. Obviously, the English are one of them. But before we start to develop all the various groups within the English camp, I want to draw your attention to the Dutch Netherlands, New Amsterdam, Fort Orange, Peter Minuit, Peter Stuyvesant. These are places and names that played a very important role on both sides of the Atlantic, and they represented one of the key components to English success. And in the end, they were victims of it. So as our narrative begins to take shape, the background of North American activity, we want to continue to develop a specific neighborhood, a specific geographical region. Europe was changing rapidly. We mentioned before of the centuries of progression from the Crusades to the Renaissance through the Reformation and the infancy of the Age of Enlightenment. We painted with a very broad brush. I think it's a good time and a good place to peel back another layer of the onion, to kind of take a closer look, or as a previous metaphor that we used, add another transparency to the model. We're going to do this regularly. We're going to kind of circle back. We're going to visit and revisit a topic or a time frame, examining it from different points. We want to use a finer brush for a while right here to expand our storyline later. You remember then that we spoke about Spain, the expanse and the longevity of our claims. So our storyline picks up not too long after the days of men like Hernan Cortez. Spain was all over the Americas, all over the Western Hemisphere. North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, the West Indies, but also Africa and Asia. Now, this was the youth and the adolescence of 300 years of their colonial empire. And at the opening of our story, Spain enjoyed global dominance. This was her zenith, her golden age. It was said of Spain before England that Spain was the empire on which the sun never sets. So by the late 1500s, a century of empire building had taken place, a worldwide presence, but also Spain had trouble closer to home. Remember, these guys were not very inclusive. They were not very tolerant. They were very autocratic. And both England and the Dutch Netherlands are part of that Spanish story. Or maybe Spain's a part of theirs. I mean, England and the Dutch Netherlands represent some of the trouble that was closer to home. In those days, intolerant Catholic Spain not only claimed a vast empire abroad, it controlled a lot more land in Europe, a lot more geography. Familiar names and places like Belgium and Holland and Flanders and Antwerp, and some that are maybe not so familiar today, like Zeeland and Utrecht, and the province of Groningen or Brabant, northern regions that would ultimately become the Dutch Netherlands. Now, this was post-Reformation Europe. These northern Spanish territories were very quickly becoming predominantly Protestant. And so in 1579, there was a Dutch revolt. It was the Union of Utrecht, where many cities and regions and northern Protestant provinces severed their allegiance to Philip II of Spain. Now, some places like Antwerp and Flanders were later retaken. Now, remember that, because that's not just an unimportant side note. There's consequences to this. The Dutch Netherlands were tolerant of different religious practices, very unique for the time, but really the antithesis of Spain. You know, I often look back on certain times in my own life and wonder if this or if that had not happened. I mean, how could this other thing have turned out? Do you do that? I'm guessing you do. I mean, is that challenging the hand of Providence? I don't know. But a lot of history can invoke the what-if card. Most of it's not really worth pursuing. I mean, generally, I'm not a fan of revisionist fiction. But Northwestern and Central European activity at this time is worth considering. Even if it's just a drive-by, it seems to scream what if about a dozen times. And when we're talking about colonial development in North America, the Dutch quest for independence is an important aspect. All the major players were involved, and what was not dealt with in the 1570s and 80s would be a few decades later. So in a very condensed summary, over the next couple of episodes, I want to work through what was going on in Europe. Here's what happened. Well, I think the best, or the at least the most efficient way to go here, is to simply talk about the folks that were involved, the nations and the people, the times that they lived in. But I kind of want to make sure that we stay on track. So, we're going to move kind of at a regulated pace, I guess. We want to remember this is just the foundational story behind the story. It's going to be very useful once we cross the Atlantic heading west. So to make things clearer, ultimately, I want to develop this from basically three positions. I want to spend some time developing it from the Dutch position and the Spanish position, and then ultimately the French position, and maybe a little bit of the English. And remember, this was post-Reformation Europe, post-Renaissance, post-100 Years' War, post-plague. It's a time of agrarian expansion in technology and productivity, and a time of urban rebirth and recovery. Europe was at a crossroads. Europe was experiencing multiple watershed moments. It's a time just after a flurry of massive cultural shifts. It's a time where Europe is in the middle of a flurry of massive cultural shifts. And it's a time when Europe is heading for more massive cultural shifts. These are the times, these are the beginning of the modern nation state, the emergence of the modern world that we live in. So to get a geographical picture in our head, let's use the face of a clock, not a digital numeric display, but a real clock face. 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I think that a useful pictorial of where these places are and how they are connected is important. The clock encompasses modern Germany and France and Belgium and the Netherlands. So the first nation to locate is France. I mean, this is the bulk of the clock's face, in all honesty. It's our North Star, the epicenter of the story. And it's located on the left side of the clock, starting at around the 10 and dropping down to the 6. Now, France was Catholic and predominantly mild toward the Protestants for a while until they weren't. And we'll get to them next episode with a little more detail. So the next country that we want to locate is England. We want to locate and highlight a few things, but we don't want to dwell too long here because we're going to be coming back to England over and over and over again. So from our North Star, France, located off the face of the clock, to the west, left, and the north, up, off the number 10 is England. And they're separated from France by the English Channel. This was Elizabeth's England. They're neither Catholic nor Protestant. They're Anglican, thanks to Henry a generation earlier. And England is trying to stay non-Catholic. It was at this time that epic battle between Elizabeth and Mary was raging. England was definitely partial to Protestants. From the mid-1550s until her death, Elizabeth was intent on disrupting Spain. She supported the piracy of Spanish ships. She stole their gold. She harbored both Dutch pirates and refugees and supported, financed, and sent troops in the 1580s to the Dutch Netherlands, and those troops remained until her death in 1603. Elizabeth was a blight on Spanish ambition, and we'll talk about her most famous victory in an episode or two. Spain, or rather Spanish territory, is the next consideration. There's actually 3 separate regions I want to isolate on our clock that would constitute Spanish Europe: the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire. So first we have Spain proper, the country of Spain that we see today, basically, found southwest to the left and into the, heading down on our clock face at about the number 7, just off the clock face. These are the Habsburgs in Spain. The second area that we want to look at then would be modern day, basically Germany, what's found starting at about the number 12 and moving clockwise to the number 3. This is the Holy Roman Empire. And the third region of the Spanish European lands that we want to look at are the Netherlands, the lowlands. They're just really a sliver of the face of the clock. They're found between the 10 and the 12, running north to south, and they're not even hitting the middle of the clock face. So the Netherlands are smaller in area than France or Germany or Spain, and they're sandwiched between France and Germany. They're right across the Strait of Dover from England, where the North Sea meets the English Channel, and they share the coastline with France. So as you can see from our clock face that France shares a border. France is surrounded by Spanish regions, and that poses a real threat to France. That's going to be a factor here in the 1570s and 80s, and again during the 30 Years' War, where the situation will be dealt with permanently. I hope this isn't too tedious. I mean, trust me, the geography is important. So we've got our clock map. Here's what happened from the mid-1550s until the late 1580s with the Dutch Netherlands. Although the trouble with the Dutch Netherlands began a few years earlier, the real struggle began in 1556, the same year that Charles V of Spain retired and divided his lands between his son Philip, who got Spain, the Habsburgs, and the Netherlands, and his brother Ferdinand, who received Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire. There were other lands like northern Italy and the colonial regions outside of Europe. All of those went to Philip as well. Spain had had an incredible journey the first half of the 16th century. I think of it like two kingdoms, basically, that Charles handed off. The first one is Spain proper, the Habsburgs, right? Ultimately, including the Netherlands, that went to his son. And then Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, went to his brother. You've got to understand the success that Charles had and that the kingdom that he controlled. The lands that Charles V controlled represented the largest continental European empire since Charlemagne, almost 800 years earlier. But because of specific pressures from France and the Lutherans and the Ottomans in Central and Eastern Europe, Charles was never able to fully unify these regions. So to keep it simple, in 1556, Charles retired to a monastery and divided his kingdom between his son, Philip II, who we're going to focus on, and his brother, Ferdinand. Now, it's interesting. Philip received the bulk of the kingdom. He received Spain and the Netherlands, the global colonies, as well as areas like Milan and Naples and Sicily. But it really wasn't solidified until the Treaty of Colonization in 1559. He actually spent the early years of his reign, the first 4 years actually, from 1555 to 1559 in the Netherlands. But once Philip set up his court in Spain, he never left, and he ruled the Netherlands from a distance through other people. Philip actually, almost out of the gate, fought a war with France in 1557. And frankly, Philip fought a lot of wars. Philip incurred tremendous debt. He fought against the Ottomans, he fought against England, he fought against the Portuguese. But this was Spain's finest hour, their greatest period. Now, as far as the Dutch Netherlands are concerned, we want to focus on three men. The first one is the Duke of Alba, or Alva. He was a faithful servant of Philip II. He was an aggressive and unpopular governor of the Netherlands. And then we want to take a look at the Duke of Parma, who was a very able, capable servant of Philip II, not only from an administrative standpoint, from a military strategist standpoint. And the third man that we want to look at is William of Orange, or William the Silent. Originally, he had been a faithful servant of Philip II, but by the end of his life, not so much. So by the time these three men enter our storyline, late 1550s, and then moving more into the 1560s, Protestantism had had major inroads in the northern regions of the Netherlands, among other places in Europe. At the conclusion of the Hispano-French War in 1559, as an act of good faith, Philip II of Spain sent 2 hostages to France to ensure the completion of the treaty of the Chateau Cambrésis. You remember, this is the treaty that solidified his lands. Philip sent William of Orange and the Duke of Alba, both faithful servants at this point. This is where William earned his nickname, William the Silent. So as the story goes, William, the hostage, was on a hunting trip with the French king, Henry II. Now, there's going to be a lot of Henrys in our narrative the next couple of episodes. These guys loved the name Henry. But at any rate, William is the hostage of Henry II. And they go on a hunting trip, and it's on this hunting trip that Henry mentions a plan between himself and Philip to kill all of the Protestants everywhere. Henry didn't think he was giving up any secrets. He really believed that William was aware of the plan, but he wasn't. William listened as Philip laid the plan out, and he kept his mouth shut. Now, his fellow hostage, the Duke of Alba, may very well have been working out the details of the plan at this time, but William was no part of that. What William was a part of was the Netherlands. He was serving as the governor of several regions of the Netherlands, several Protestant regions, like Holland and Zeeland and Utrecht. William decided that he would not just sit by and allow this atrocity to occur. So it's kind of an odd thing. He's a French-speaking Catholic at the time. He's born in Nassau, Germany, raised as a Lutheran, but he was sympathetic to his new Dutch countrymen. And it wasn't long after this time of serving as a hostage, while treaty negotiations are going on, William married Anna of Saxony. Now, Anne is one of 4 wives that he would have over the years. This may well have been a political marriage to gain the favor of the Saxon Protestant German alliances that he would need later. I mean, maybe not, but he would need these alliances and he would use them in the end. So meanwhile, William's counterpart and one-time fellow hostage in France, in the course of time, was sent to the Netherlands by Philip to put down the Protestant rebellion. The Duke of Alba was a tyrannical governor of the Netherlands. He served from 1567 to 1573. He was a very heavy-handed enforcer of Spanish rule. That's saying a lot. I mean, if you remember, they're not so big on insubordination. Now, the Duke of Alba had been very faithful to the Spanish crown. He had served 2 kings, first Charles V and then Philip II, and he was very successful in his career. But his time in the Netherlands was a major setback, a real blemish. He failed miserably. Now, throughout history, certain men have appeared at certain times as if they'd been prepared for a time such as this. Men suited and equipped for a specific role, an improbable task. William was just such a man destined to become the recognized founder of the United Provinces of the Netherlands. William was a man whose great-grandson would one day be William III of England and stadtholder of the Netherlands. Now, during this time, from the time of the Hispano-French War, from the time it ended in 1559 until now, 1567, the governor of the Netherlands had been Philip's half-sister, Margaret of Parma. She tried to appease the Protestants with moderation, but ultimately was forced to bring an army in after Protestants attacked Catholic churches. So you've got growing tensions, right? I mean, Catholics aren't getting along with Protestants. Protestants aren't getting along with Catholics. Margaret's just looking to put down the uprisings, but William had sided with the Protestants. He had encouraged the Protestants. It's at this time that Philip replaced Margaret with the Duke of Alba, who came with a Spanish army of 10,000 men intending to put the resistance down hard. The year was 1567. Now, the Duke of Alba marched his 10,000 troops from the area of northern Italy on the highway known as the Spanish Road. Now, you remember that the Netherlands are sandwiched between Germany and France at the time. A France who was a competing Catholic state, a France who had recently fought a war with Spain. It's that France that watched 10,000 Spanish troops marching their direction. It made them very uneasy. Now, these 2 countries had had their share of trouble, and they were going to have their share of trouble in the future. The following year, in 1568, William, along with his brother Louis of Nassau, invaded the Netherlands. The revolt had its ups and downs. It had its victories, it had its retreats. And after one of these brief retreats to France, Louis managed to enlist the aid of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, which we're going to cover on the next episode. Now, the idea of aiding the revolt in the Netherlands was not a simple affair in France. It was a big deal. But Louis returned to the Netherlands, aid in hand, continuing to fight until his death in 1574. Now, there's a couple of other things that we want to take a look at of what's going on in the Netherlands right now that will ultimately help us to understand what happens in the New World. If you remember, I mentioned before that Philip fought a lot of wars. It is not cheap nor easy to maintain an empire. Philip ultimately went bankrupt. Through all the years of uprising in the Netherlands, pay could be tough to come by, and so pillaging of the quote-unquote enemy cities was a common thing. And this pillaging is remembered as a series of atrocities that are known collectively as the Spanish Fury. Now, there came a time, an in-between time of governors when things got really out of hand, and the atrocity of atrocities was committed. It was an inspiration to an internal, quote-unquote, Dutch movement that almost lost the whole of the Netherlands for Philip II. You see, by 1576, the Duke of Alba was gone. He'd been gone for a couple of years, and his ultimate replacement was not there yet. The Spanish coffers were empty. The army was unpaid again, and the troops took matters into their own hands with a severity that they had never done before. Now think about it. I mean, poverty and power vacuums and constant violence can wreak havoc on any community or any society. But think about it, how much more it's compounded when you've got soldiers, and I always think of them as possibly mostly young men, far from home, with no local ties. I mean, this is setting you up for horrible consequences, even among those that are supposed to bring order. And so it was in November of 1576, the city of Antwerp was sacked. Antwerp was Protestant, and it was obliterated. And when the carnage was over, 1,000 buildings had been burned. I mean, imagine 1,000 buildings in a modern city burned. Imagine the 1,000 buildings in a New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago or Dallas or, Rochester, New York, close to where I live, or Buffalo or Syracuse. Devastating. Psychologically, emotionally, financially. Imagine 1,000 buildings burned in a city 300 or 400 years ago, 500 years ago. The cities were not as big as they are today. A big city then would be a very small city today. On top of the 1,000 buildings being burned, 17,000 citizens were killed. Imagine 17,000 citizens killed. Women were raped. The women in your neighborhood, people that you've grown up with or known, sisters, wives, mothers, aunts. Whatever was left of any value was plundered. The city was absolutely decimated. And the anger and the disgust came from all quarters of the quote-unquote locals, the fellow countrymen from north to south, Protestant and Catholic alike, all came together. It's not surprising. I mean, think about the galvanizing effect localized terror can bring. I mean, we do tend to sympathize more with those that we've got most in common with, right? In the end. I mean, think about 9/11 in the United States, the unity that was harvested from the immediate aftermath of that tragedy. I was a jail counselor for about 10 years. And I would do individual one-on-one counseling, but I would also do, we'd have group conversations. And when the idea came up about unity or about culture or society or the concept of community, one of the illustrations that I would use was found in Matthew's Gospel in the New Testament, at the birth of Jesus. And Herod is the king sitting in Jerusalem, and he's heard that the coming king has been born, the coming king that will ultimately take his throne. He's terrified. I mean, the whole city was terrified. They didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, Herod's a maniac. Now his position is being threatened existentially. Well, the wise men come and they seek from Herod the location of the child. And Herod tells the wise men that he doesn't know where the child is either, but if they would simply go and find where the child is and come and tell him, he would like to come and offer his homage as well. I mean, the real goal was to find out where the child was to kill it, right? So the wise men, they go and they pay their homage to Jesus, and then knowing what Herod's ultimate plan would probably be, they leave and go home and don't tell him. When Herod finds out that he's been duped, when they don't come back and tell him, he absolutely flips his lid. And he had all of the children, all of the males killed from 2 and under in this small community. Now think about the trauma on that community. Think about the terror of, again, much like in Antwerp, a foreign army, soldiers that have no real binding concern for your community come in and just simply start butchering all of your little boys. Well, even in a situation or in a setting like in the jail where everybody's got high testosterone and they've been locked up for a while and everybody's on edge, even in that situation, all of those inmates would rally around the concept of continuity and of community and of unity at that point in time. I mean, the outrage is virtually universal. And so it is, I think oftentimes our lack of anger over injustice, it's not because of indifference. It's because of ignorance. It's because of distance. Maybe it's better to say it's because of a lack of proximity, right, to the event itself. But the careful consideration of history can illumine our minds to this deficiency that we all have. So imagine this happening today. Imagine the outrage. And then imagine the experience back then. I mean, life was slower back then. People of a community were closer. I don't know that they cared more about somebody else. I mean, the word love didn't mean any more to them than it does to us, but people were far more connected back then. These atrocities weren't just, filler and fodder for the 24-hour news cycle. They resonated with these folks. And there was for a time in the Netherlands a mutual agreement from north to south, Catholic to Protestant, to separate from Spain. Both sides were willing to make concessions to the other. And this agreement became known as the Pacification of Ghent. And Elizabeth and England supported everything that was going on. Things got so bad in the Netherlands that the Spanish even withdrew for about a year. This is where Philip played his greatest hand, right here, at the seemingly point of no return. The following year, in 1578, the Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese, Margaret's son, Philip's nephew, it's all in the family here. 1578, with all of this going on in the Netherlands, the troops are not being paid, the atrocities are getting worse, the foment and the revolt is gaining momentum. Philip sends his nephew to take care of business. And the Duke of Parma arrives on the scene and makes the best of a bad situation. If you remember, I told you before, he's an excellent administrator. In the end, the Duke of Parma secured the southern Netherlands, basically today's Belgium and Luxembourg, for the crown. The Duke of Parma was an excellent diplomat and a military commander, and he made the pacification of Ghent go away, convincing the Catholic South to stay the course with Spain. The Duke of Parma managed to permanently void the pacification of Ghent. That's impressive. Consider again the emotional pull that these folks must have felt toward their northern brethren. The north was essentially lost to Spain at this point. Antwerp and Flanders had been regained. And this is an important area. It's kind of like this weird side note, but this area, it's important that it was retaken because later, this was going to be the army pickup point for the Spanish Armada. And again, we're going to talk about the Armada in a little more detail in a couple of episodes. Flanders is very near Ghent. It's about 60 miles from the seaport of Antwerp. So when the Armada came, it was supposed to pick up the army that had come from Flanders. The historical relevance, it's almost like a deja vu. Antwerp's like 100 miles away from Dunkirk. Dunkirk is one of the most celebrated retreats of all time. You remember when 300,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated in late May, early June of 1940 during World War II, ahead of the advancing Germans. It was the same area that was liberated 5 years later. It's an interesting geography in such a small pinprick of a place. But in 1579, as I had mentioned previously, the greater Dutch population gave up on the idea of reunification with the South, minus Spanish rule. So you've got the Union of Arras united the South with the Duke of Parma, ultimately in Spain, while the Union of Utrecht united the northern provinces, essentially, at least for a short time, at some point, with France. That same year, 1579, is also when Philip II outlawed William of Orange. So William is seeking aid from France, and Philip's outlawing William. William now becomes the leader of the North, and he would continue to be the North's leader until his assassination in 1584. Elizabeth's support was key in those years. And there's two additional events that occurred at this time that I think warrant at least some mention as we consider the absolute irrationality of the northern provinces ever gaining any type of foothold toward independence. Spain, a global power, a major continental landowner, versus this pinprick of geography, massive, almost unlimited resources versus very limited resources and a very limited population. But first of all, the Dutch under William did manage to unite with the French, at least for a time. And secondly, you remember William had married Anna of Saxony. And this opened the door for the assistance of German mercenaries who were utilized. Remember, William had been born and raised a Lutheran, but insisted on tolerance. And in 1573, he joined the Calvinist Church. So yes, I think he played loosey-goosey with his denominational affiliations, but in all honesty, I think a lot of people do. And the following year, in 1580, that's the pivotal year. This is the year that the die would be cast. It was the year that Philip put a 25,000 crown, Spanish currency at the time, bounty on William's death. Not his capture. He's no longer simply labeled an outlaw. Philip will give a $25,000 crown reward for anybody that kills William. It was also the year that the vaunted French support was secured. For a while. If nothing else, emotionally. I mean, here's how this went down. By this time, France was ruled not by Henry II, but by Henry III. And Francis, the Duke of Anjou. Now, the Duke of Anjou was granted the title Protector of the Liberties of the Netherlands. This title, Protector of the Liberties of the Netherlands, along with William and the provinces renouncing support for Philip of Spain, at the Treaty of Plessis-les-Tours, essentially brought French support. That's a big deal. Now you've got Catholic versus Catholic state, with the quote-unquote trophy being a Protestant ally for France, or the trophy remaining a vassal state for Spain. That's a big deal. So it is on July 22nd, 1581, the States General officially rejected Philip. They no longer just said they don't recognize him. They no longer said we're separating. They've now rejected Philip II outright. That's recognized as the act of abjuration. And about 6 months later, early in 1582, the Duke of Anjou arrives in Flushing. He was an absolute disappointment and flat-out scoundrel. He wanted to arrive with a lot of pomp and circumstance, but it was interrupted 1 month later, his arrival, because on March 18th, William survived an assassination attempt. The intensity of his care destroyed his wife, Charlotte, and she died less than 2 months later of exhaustion. So the Duke of Anjou shows up, the long-awaited French support, very public, very open, and almost immediately, somebody tries to kill William of Orange. He's recovering for a couple of months. His wife has worked so hard to keep him alive, she basically drops dead of exhaustion herself. The national attention has been on William, and the Duke of Anjou is very unhappy. After Charlotte's death, the Duke of Anjou's unhappiness and his unpopularity take center stage for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that Holland and Zeeland disliked him so much they refused to recognize his authority. Now, the one saving grace here is that his mere presence did scare the Duke of Parma. I mean, it made Spain pay attention. But it's interesting, in his unhappiness, somewhere along the way, the Duke of Anjou decided that he wanted Antwerp for himself, and he is going to take it. Now remember Antwerp, the rebellious Protestant city, the one that had been absolutely decimated by the unpaid Spanish troops, then recovered by Spain, and now coveted by yet another Catholic foreigner, someone supposedly there to help. It's amazing what those people went through in such a short time. But they got wind of the Duke of Anjou's plan, and on the 18th of January, 1583, the Antwerpians attacked first. Most of Anjou's men were killed. He managed to survive, and he left the country about 6 months later. But the whole episode is just a little embarrassing for both the Duke of Anjou and William of Orange. There's just a little bit more going on that we want to cover right now. Now, if you remember, William's wife Charlotte did not survive his assassination attempt from the previous year. Charlotte died on May 5th in 1582. 11 months later, on April 12th in 1583, William married his fourth and final wife, Louise de Coligny. Now, I got to say right here, first of all, the guy's already had 3 previous wives. You got to start wondering, he's not very good at keeping women around, right? So it's kind of interesting to me that wife number 4 would become wife number 4. Maybe that's just me. But she seems like a brave lady right out of the gate. But Louise de Coligny was more than just a 4th wife for William, more than just a brave lady. She's a French Huguenot, and she's more than just a French Huguenot. She's Gaspard de Coligny's daughter. Gaspard de Coligny had been a very important man in French society just a few years earlier. So I think now that we've brought the concept up of the French, between the reputation of the Duke of Anjou taking a massive hit, and then the mention of Gaspard de Coligny, I think it's a good idea, and it would be very helpful moving forward if we also give some attention to France and to what's happening at this time. I mean, it might be better to back up actually and observe a few decades of French high society to really get a handle on the atmosphere. Because the atmosphere in France at this time sheds some light here, but will invariably find itself transferred to the frontier of North America in just a few decades. It's a fascinating story, but I think we'll save that for next time. I do hope you'll come back.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.